So, what did you think about the case study where we saw that we encourage people to donate their kidney, but we don't allow them to sell their kidneys? Did you think maybe the human body is really valuable or sacred and we ought to be really cautious in getting people to give up part of their body? Did you think maybe bad things will happen if we allow a market on organs? People in dire straits feeling forced to sell other organs that they need even more than kidneys. Those are really interesting answers. There are certainly ethicists who spell out those sorts of responses, and I'm curious to see what all of you had to say about this. But what we're going to focus on now in Unit 1 is what a virtue ethicist might say about this case study. So, a virtue ethicist might say, well, look, it's more virtuous to donate your kidney rather than sell it. In other words, a good person would want to donate their kidney. Um, and it's good to create rules for society that encourage people to build virtuous habits. We want to design our spaces, our employment, our social mores, our education system to help people develop good habits to become good people. Good person, virtuous person. And by habits, we don't mean something that you just do automatically. We mean things that you do over and over again. You practice making good decisions in order to become a virtuous person. So, Bjorkman, who was quoted in the case study, takes a virtue ethics kind of response to it. And he says the following. So, how can we meet this requirement to encourage people to develop good habits? And quote, how do we determine whether virtuous persons would donate rather than sell their organs? Character traits have to be stable. That is, the disposition has to be firm and unchanging, and should, in this context, be understood as something that is manifested in habitual action. So let me pause there. What he's saying here is we want character traits that are things that people do no matter what. They're firm and unchanging, they last throughout time. This is what you'll see Aristotle will also say. Now back to Björkman. In short, moral virtues are those virtues that are good for everyone to have. Virtues come from character traits that we typically find to be admirable. And for Aristotle, they come from his idea about human nature. But they are traits that are manifested by people we look up to. To quote Bjorkman again, these are the kind of people we ought to model ourselves on when seeking to act virtuously. It seems plausible to argue that it's more admirable to donate than sell one's organs. We look up to those who take personal risks not for the sake of getting money, but simply because they see that helping their fellow man is a fine and worthwhile thing to do. Presumably, this could be the practical expression of a number of virtues such as unselfishness, generosity, kindness, beneficence. This is a list of traits, and you'll see that Aristotle eventually will give us a list of traits that the good or virtuous person has. Now, back to Bjorkman. He says, it does not necessarily follow from the belief that people ought to be virtuous that society should facilitate or encourage such behavior. But according to Aristotle, however, there is such a connection. Okay, so what is Bjorkman saying here? He's saying, look, not only is it better in terms of your virtue or your character to donate your organ rather than sell it, it's the case that society should be trying to get us to be good people. And so society should set things up to encourage people to donate rather than sell their organs. Now, what kinds of virtues come from donating your organ? Well, according to Bjorkman, he says, well, for one, You're courageous. If you are donating your organ, you are making a sort of self sacrifice. You're jeopardizing your own well being, right? Anytime you have a surgery, there's some risk. Um, and the courageous person is someone who stands firm, right? You keep on doing what you've set out to do, even though there's some amount of risk or danger. So, back to Bjorkman. He says, it seems reasonable to suggest that a contributing motive for selling a kidney in a situation where one could have chosen to donate would be personal gain. It can then be argued from the fact that someone will be compensated monetarily for the risk they're about to take, partially detracts from the self sacrifice, right? If you're paying me to be self sacrificing, am I really doing a self sacrifice? And that self sacrifice is central to the virtue of courage. One more virtue that Bjorkman points out comes from donating an organ rather than selling it, and that's being generous or open handed. It involves attempting to share your good fortune with those in need, he says. Now, perhaps having two working kidneys might not be considered affluence under normal circumstances, but when contrasted with a dialysis patient, it just might. So he's saying, look, if you're rich, perhaps you should share some of your wealth. We don't usually think of having two working kidneys as being wealthy. I have two working kidneys. I would not usually call myself wealthy. Professors just don't make that much money. um, but he says when you contrast that with someone who's on dialysis, it might seem like a kind of wealth or richness. And so giving away something out of the goodness of your heart, not seeking reward, qualifies as being generous in a way that selling your kidney just doesn't. So that's Bjorkman's response to the case study. And I think that gives us a good sense of a preview of some of what we're going to find in Aristotle. So Aristotle's going to propose one, that the most important thing is to become a good person, not just figure out what's a good thing to do in one circumstance. Two, Aristotle's going to say we want to form habits. We want to have things set up so that we form habits to become a good person. And three, that we ought to make rules in society that encourage the formation of good habits, such as being generous, being courageous. And those are things that our system of kidney donation, rather than a market for selling and buying kidneys, manifest. Those are things that Aristotle presumably would like. So I think that that gives you a kind of sense of how this works and how it might differ from other approaches to ethics that might say, let's look at the consequences, or let's look at human rights, or let's look at what is our duty to do. What virtue ethics instead is going to look at is how do you become a good person? And how do we set up the system to encourage people to be a good person? And then if we need to think about what to do in a situation, we're going to think, well, what would the good person do? What would someone who I admire do? So this is just to give you a sense of where we're going with this. And next, we're going to take a look at some just general things to know before you dive into reading Aristotle.